As you are well aware, the SADC Parliamentary Forum brings together 15 SADC member parliaments in the region and often sits to debate and interrogate the issues that are here today. I wish to start by applauding this conference initiative, which is pivotal, which is of pivotal importance to all regions of Africa. Indeed, at the level of the SADC Parliamentary Forum, debt servicing and structuring have been one of the major concerns expressed by the SADC parliamentarians over the past years. And as Mr. Bagranza has indicated, this has happened largely over the past 2 years, where this issue has been high on the agenda. Today, as we speak, many countries across the world are apprehending bankruptcy or insolvency due to their public debt obligations, thus making public debt a predominant factor that potentially leads a state to failure. In the SADC region, it is not uncommon for countries to have a public debt to GDP ratio of about 70%, with discrepancies in calculations that indicate that real figures may actually be higher. So the keynote address, the opening remarks this morning, can only be something that I wish each parliament could listen to. At the same time, there's also the stark realization that revenue streams and income will remain low for some time, given that countries are still recovering in the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic. And with the rise in commodity price unlikely to be resolved in the short term, for most countries in Southern Africa, early debt repayment thus appears to be a dim and remote possibility. And the debt situation is not likely to change unless prompt and bold debt reform is undertaken. I loved the revolutionary remarks that were made this morning at the beginning, and I also wish these could be replicated and shared across the continent. I wish to highlight that from the perspective of the SADC parliamentarians, they have deemed fit to push for reform on debt through harmonization of regional norms and benchmarks. Indeed, the forum has recently adopted the SADC Model Law on Public Financial Management at the last 51st Plenary Assembly session, which was held in Lilongwe, Malawi, from the 7th to the 16th of July 2022, as was alluded to by the Director of Ceremonies. The model law clearly provides that debt ceilings should remain under 60%, with progression to lower debt percentages, and that regular reports need to be made to Parliament by the executive on the debt ceiling. These provisions on debt servicing were deemed necessary since constitutionally it is only Parliament which is endowed with the requisite powers and mandate to conduct oversight of executive action, including on public debt. During the deliberations for the model law, it was also canvassed that major contracts made by the government which exceed a percentage of GDP should be ratified by Parliament before being executed. This is especially important if the major contract to be executed relates to a project which was not included in the political manifesto of the party in power. In addition, there is a need to account to Parliament on the public debt details, that is, the proportion of domestic and foreign debt, the countries involved, the terms of repayment, among others, so as to ensure that there is transparency and openness on the debt obligations contracted by the state. Furthermore, there is a need to consider how debt obligations are structured within government or through public companies or statutory bodies to avoid situations of hidden debt, which may give a false illusion of financial stability. While I'm sure that debt servicing and structuring will be addressed from different angles by the presenters during this conference, I wish to also underscore that weak public debt servicing acts directly against democratic principles. Indeed, if the executive of a particular country enters into highly onerous contracts which make public debt become 100% or 200% of GDP, then an incoming government will already have its hands tied. In other words, despite a change in government and a turnover of members of parliament, both in the executive and in parliament, they'll have no leeway to implement new projects, except than to run operations to repay the debt taken. In this respect, it is an infringement of democracy if at a given point in time, the executive burdens the state with the public debt, which can only be repaid over decades, thus over many successive election terms. Distinguished delegates, debt servicing and structuring thus impacts directly on a democracy and its prospect of progress. As I end, I would like to recall that public debt is not an issue in itself. All countries leverage on debt to finance important projects in a timely manner. Short-term or long-term debt instruments and debentures are commonly used to implement developmental objectives to alleviate poverty, such as building of schools, hospitals, among others. However, the issue lies with the terms of the debt, the quantity of the debt and its quality. Debt can sink nations as well as make nations prosper. It is therefore quintessential that there is a robust accountability framework surrounding public sector debt, with regular and consistent oversight by Parliament. I therefore urge all stakeholders present today to work closely with the SADC Parliamentary Forum, with Afrodad and many other players and partners in this field to ensure that Parliament remains at the center stage of debt reform initiatives.
Policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first.